Hello, welcome everyone. This is a summer walking tour, virtual walking tour, obviously, that we are doing. We'll be doing another one next week, also with Lucie. We will have a actual video walking tour coming out sometime later on this month, possibly in September as well, with our Sick to Celebrate groups. And we will continue to do various forms of both in-camera walking tours that you can watch, as well as the Zoom virtual tours for as long as necessary, really. We also have a bunch already up on our YouTube channel and on our website that you can watch, so head on over there, explore the city from your couch in the air conditioning. It's a little nice, actually. And with that, I will hand it over to Lucie.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you for HDC for having me. I am so excited to share Brownstones and ballot boxes, women's suffrage history in Brooklyn. Proudly to give this tour, of course, in August 2020, which is the centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment. And it's also lovely to focus on Brooklyn Heights for a group like HDC, because of course Brooklyn Heights was the very first historic district designated here in New York City. So the story of suffrage in Brooklyn Heights really did begin with a brownstone and end with a ballot box, and I will tell you exactly which brownstone in just a moment. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about these brownstones and this historic district, because of course I'm speaking to the Historic Districts Council, right? So the original landmarks designation for Brooklyn Heights is dated November 23rd, 1965. It's the first historic district in the city of New York to be designated under the 1965 landmarks law. So that designation designated everything you see outlined in red. And the designation states that the stately brick and brownstone houses on their tree-lined streets with stone sidewalks represent most of the principal architectural styles of the 19th century. As seen today, interspersed by stately churches, the houses represent almost unchanged the community as originally built. So we can see when we look at Brooklyn Heights, this is Hicks and Joralemon streets, a photo in 1905 and a photo from contemporary photography, so from today. And we can see that we're looking at the same buildings, right? That the historic landmarks designation gives us an incredibly cohesive streetscape when we're thinking about history. So when this was designated, the Brooklyn Heights Association itself testified in front of the LPC that of the 1,248 buildings fronting the streets within this proposed historic district, at least 684 were built before the Civil War, and over 1,000 were built before the turn of the century. So the Brooklyn Heights Historic District Association testified that there were federal brownstones here, there were Greek Revival, there was Gothic Revival, there was Anglo-Italianate buildings. So what the LPC was doing when it was designating Brooklyn Heights is that it was trying to preserve as cohesively as possible an evocation of an old streetscape, of old New York. And what I think is really interesting about this is that Brooklyn Heights was essentially landmarked because of its incredible architectural bona fides. But the landmarks law, when it was written in 1965, also included provisions for landmarking on the basis of cultural significance, as well as social, economic, and political history. Now, social and cultural landmarks have gotten much more attention in recent years than they did back in 1965 when this historic district was first designated. For example, there's a current battle right now in downtown Brooklyn, just a stone's throw really from Brooklyn Heights. I'm talking, of course, about 227 Duffield Street in downtown Brooklyn. Now, preservationists advocated for hours just a few weeks ago on July 14th with testimony in front of the LPC, hoping to get landmark status for this building because it had been home to an active abolitionist couple named Thomas and Harriet Lee Truesdale. Now, what's interesting about this building, which is so different from what we see in Brooklyn Heights, because Brooklyn Heights was landmarked as a district, you didn't have the degree of changes to the buildings that you see here. So you can see on a building like this one, the original structure is sitting behind what is then an addition in the front. And the point of cultural landmarking would be that even though this building has been altered, it could still be landmarked based on its cultural significance and not based on the fact that the architectural integrity of the building has changed since it was built. Now, the Truesdales lived here from 1851 to 1863, but before that, from 1838 to 1851, they actually did live in Brooklyn Heights at 14 Hicks Street. But that building was actually torn down to build the Brooklyn Queens Expressway. So while we can say that much of Brooklyn Heights was saved due to landmarking and much of the historic streetscape is incredibly intact, we can see that, of course, not all of it was. But whether or not the buildings remain intact, and we're so lucky that in Brooklyn Heights they have, there is cultural significance even to these incredible brownstones that we see in Brooklyn Heights that give us an evocation of old New York from even antebellum America, even before the Civil War. We're seeing this incredible streetscape, but even if we weren't, what I hope this tour will show us is that there is so much cultural history here in Brooklyn Heights related to the suffrage movement, to the abolitionist movement, and to a host of other social movements, that even if Brooklyn Heights, like even if all of Brooklyn Heights was altered in this way, it would still be worth landmarking. And I hope that that is something that comes through in this talk, is that cultural landmarks, we can find them anywhere we look, even if we're looking at extraordinary architecture. You know, there are reasons to landmark certainly beyond architecture. So for myself also as a historian, even beyond that, my understanding of history is that it is the study of change and continuity in human experience through time. And when we're looking at something like Brooklyn Heights, because it is so well preserved, we get to have this really wonderful visual experience with continuity, where we're seeing buildings that are still standing. But we're also speaking, when we're speaking about suffrage, we're speaking about this incredible fight for change, for political change, even though we are seeing it mapped over an incredibly continuous streetscape. So to me, that's a really interesting way of looking at history. So let's begin. All right. We really begin here. This is where our story starts, in Brooklyn Heights. Now, Brooklyn's first really passionate advocate for suffrage in this neighborhood was a woman named Anna Seafield, who lived here at 158 Hicks Street. Now, this building dates to 1855, but this structure and Anna Seafield living within it will enter the fray in 1868. So in the fall of 1868, Anna Seafield, this is her, held the inaugural meeting of the Brooklyn Equal Rights Association in her home. Now, that evening, about 20 men and women who had been part of the abolitionist movement, including Celia Burleigh, who went on to become the first female ordained Unitarian minister in the United States, as well as another minister I think many of us may know well, Henry Ward Beecher, who was the abolitionist preacher of the Plymouth Church in Brooklyn Heights, as well as a myriad of other reformers, met in Field's home to throw their support behind what they called, quote, a new outlet in the cause of justice, which was women's rights. Now, the stated goal of the Brooklyn Equal Rights Association was, quote, the promotion of educational, industrial, legal, and political equality for women, and especially the right of suffrage. Now, this association, formally organized in May 1869. So while Anna C. Field has this meeting in her home in 1868, the organization formally incorporated 1869. And 1869 is a very significant year for the women's suffrage movement. So 1868 and 1869 are significant because they are tumultuous. So the American Equal Rights Association had been founded in 1866 by suffragists and abolitionists, including, Sojourner Truth, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Frederick Douglass, and a host of reformers who were looking to advocate for universal franchise regardless of sex and race. So that's 1866. But this group broke up over the support of the 15th Amendment because the 15th Amendment granted the vote to Black men, but not to women. Of course, that was only a nominal guarantee because voter suppression and things like literacy tests and other forms of terrorism against Black people, of course, made it virtually impossible for Black men, and certainly after the 19th Amendment, Black women, to vote really until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But in a nominal way, the 15th Amendment stood to grant the franchise to Black men, but not to women, and the women's suffrage movement split bitterly over that amendment. In 1869, two new organizations come out of what had been the American Equal Rights Association. And they are the National Women's Suffrage Association, led by chiefly Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and then the American Women's Suffrage Association. I'll say that again because I know that's confusing. You had the National Women's Suffrage Association, led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I'm sorry, I'm taking a drink of water. And then you had the American Women's Suffrage Association, led by a whole myriad of people. Now, the difference was that the National Women's Suffrage Association, led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, was opposed to the 15th Amendment because it did not enfranchise women. And Susan B. Anthony was quoted as saying that she would rather cut off her right arm than advocate for the vote for a Black man for a woman. So our understanding as historians of Susan B. Anthony has really shifted in the past several years. But the National Women's Suffrage Association actually wrote the official history of the suffrage movement, beginning with Seneca Falls and so on and so forth. And so they left out, to a very large degree, their rival, which was the American Women's Suffrage Association, which was led by both men and women who supported the 15th Amendment. Among them were Lucy Stone, Frances Ellen Watkins Parker, who also helped found the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, Henry Ward Beecher, whom I spoke about just a moment ago, Sojourner Truth, and Josephine Ruffin, who also founded the nation's first Black women's newspaper called the Women's Era. So these reformers, these advocates, were also mapped right onto the people who were part of and who supported the Brooklyn Women's Suffrage Association. Now, when the Brooklyn Women's Suffrage Association kicks off its very first meeting, it will do so in 1869 at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. Now, often today when we think of the Brooklyn Academy of Music, of course, we think of Fort Greene, where BAM has been since 1903. But prior to 1903, it was actually in Brooklyn Heights. It was founded in Brooklyn Heights on Montague Street in 1861. Now, a couple of things about this are really important. One is that it's important to realize that the Brooklyn Equal Rights Association is the first suffrage association in what was then the city of Brooklyn, right? We don't have the consolidation of Brooklyn and Manhattan into Greater New York until January 1st, 1898. So at this point, this is a separate city. This is the city of Brooklyn. And the Brooklyn Equal Rights Association is the first and then the premier women's suffrage association in the city, and then what will become the borough. And this city, this organization, chooses very consciously in 1869, when the women's suffrage movement is having this schism, to align itself with an abolitionist integrated tradition of reform. And there are several reasons why a robust women's movement drawing on the abolitionist heritage would take root in Brooklyn Heights in particular. And there are several reasons. One is that, of course, there's a great deal of abolitionist ferment already in Brooklyn Heights and in also downtown Brooklyn throughout the 19th century. So we already talked about 227 Duffield just a moment ago. This is, of course, the Plymouth Church at 57 Orange Street, which was founded in 1849 by Henry Ward Beecher. Beecher's church would soon become known locally here in Brooklyn as the Grand Central Depot of Brooklyn's Underground Railroad. Not only that, this is the current image, so you can see. And then not only that, there was also the old Bridge Street Church in downtown Brooklyn, which was known as a center of Black Brooklyn. And we're going to come back to this church later when we talk about some of the first Black women's suffrage organizations. But this was also a center of the Underground Railroad. So we have in Brooklyn Heights and downtown Brooklyn a very robust abolitionist heritage. And not only that, oh, I'm sorry, this is a current image of the old Bridge Street Church. It's actually now owned by NYU. It's part of the Metro Tech campus. But not only that, what I want to say about Brooklyn Heights is not only does this area have these sort of abolitionist landmarks and spiritual landmarks like churches, but also there is a deep preeminence of the cultural fabric of Brooklyn is here. So I mentioned already that this suffrage organization, this first Brooklyn suffrage organization, meets at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, which was at that time in Brooklyn Heights. But also, this is the Brooklyn Institute on Cadman Plaza East, which was founded in the 1840s. You can see it around 1810. And it would become what is now the Brooklyn Museum, which is, of course, on Eastern Parkway today. But at the time, it was also here in Brooklyn Heights. And what I mean about that is that here was a community that had not only this spiritual background, and so this very open idea about equality through spirituality, but also a cultural preeminence that gave it space for new types of ideas to thrive. I always like the quote by Betty Friedan, who said that she might not have written The Feminine Mystique had the New York Public Library not at the very same time opened the Frederick Lewis Allen Reading Room, which is both a joke and not, in the sense that Friedan and probably would have written The Feminine Mystique or had those ideas, whether or not, of course, the New York Public Library had a space where she could write that book, but because the library did have that space, because the library gave her that space, it was easier. And so the point that I'm making about Brooklyn Heights here is that we can see Brooklyn Heights in the middle of the 19th century having a higher level, a higher concentration, of cultural and spiritual institutions than other parts of Brooklyn, which means that it had the fabric of the neighborhood itself, the physical fabric of the neighborhood, lent itself to a real flowering of these movements because there was place and space for them to flourish, which is why when we talk today about investing in communities and community space, that's part of why. Now, not only that, this was also a very wealthy community, right? If we can look at not only this beautiful architecture and these beautiful spaces, but also the money that it took to build them, that we have a very wealthy population in Brooklyn Heights, right? The community that originally built up Brooklyn Heights, these were single family homes. The women who lived here and who were part of the earliest women's suffrage organizations, by and large, not all of them, certainly there were working class women even at the beginning, but by and large in Brooklyn Heights, these were women who had the means and the time to be involved in this work. I always like the quote from Virginia Woolf. Everybody knows the room of her own quote, right? To write, a woman needs a room of her own. But the full quote is a woman needs money and a room of her own, right? And so these two things go hand in hand, and we see them both here in Brooklyn Heights. And so all of these things, this spiritual background, wealth, as well as sort of civic engagement and cultural engagement, we can see really coming to life in the work of Celia Burleigh, who will become an extraordinary mover and shaker in this community. This is another cultural institution. I forgot I had this picture, so I'll tell you now. A cultural institution here in, of course, this is the Brooklyn Historical Society. This was built by George B. Post, 1879 to 1881. So again, it's just another example of the cultural institutions that make this just a perfect sort of lightning rod for the women's movement. In fact, the Kings County Political Equality League, when it's founded in 1894, will actually have its first meeting here in the Brooklyn Historical Society. Now we get to Celia Burleigh. So Celia Burleigh was born in Casanova, New York, in upstate New York, and she had a career as a journalist. So she moved with her third husband, William Burleigh, to Brooklyn in 1865. The two separated shortly after moving here to Brooklyn, but she remained a journalist and a women's activist. Now, she got involved in the women's movement in 1868 for several reasons. One was that a group of other women were denied entry to the New York Press Club event honoring Charles Dickens, on the grounds that their presence at that event would make the event, quote, promiscuous. So in response, She and 12 other women who were also journalists at this time became founding members of Sororists, which was the first professional women's organization in the United States. Now, there's a very famous photograph of the Sororist luncheon at Delmonico's in Manhattan in 1868. This was the first time that a restaurant in New York City outside the company of men. Previous to this, it was not only unheard of, but also actually illegal for women to dine alone outside the company of men. And so Sororis takes this on, and this was a very famous luncheon that they host at Delmonico's in 1868. But 1868 is a very big year, as we've been speaking about, for the women's movement and also for Celia Burleigh herself. She was present at Anna C. Field's house for the first meeting of the Brooklyn Women's Suffrage Association, and she became its secretary. She would later become its first president. Now, she was actually featured as a speaker at that BAM meeting in 1869. She was on stage at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and she said, "The object of the government should be securing to every human soul the right to make good on the faculties of itself. Suffrage was the goal," she said, "but only part of it, because, quote, suffrage held the promise that every woman would one day belong to herself, live her own life, think her own thoughts, and become a woman in a better sense than she had ever yet been." Now, the idea of women belonging to themselves in every area of their lives led her not only to be a suffragist, but also an advocate for other forms of equality, like professional equality. Now, she already was a member of Sororis, but the following year, 1869, she and Anna C. Field together helped found the Brooklyn Women's Club, which still exists. It now functions out of Park Slope, but it was originally headquartered in Brooklyn Heights at 114 Pierpont Street, which you see here. Now, in addition to suffrage work, the club assisted the Kings County Bureau of Charities and established, among other things, the Brooklyn Free Kindergarten. Burleigh's work on professional as well as political equality reflected her expansive view of equality, which was that equality was not just professional, it was not just political, it was not just sexual, it was not just any one category of equality. In fact, it was the equality of the soul. And the reason that I talk about the equality of the soul is that Celia Burleigh became the first female pastor to be ordained within the Unitarian Church. When she was ordained, Julia Ward Howe, who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic, was there for the ceremony. There was an op-ed recently in the New York Times that asked, is there a religious left? And when we look at both the abolitionist movement and certainly the early women's movement, we can say absolutely yes, that it was in so many circumstances members of, like Celia Burleigh herself and Julia Ward Howe, who was not a clergy person, but did write that hymn, who were thinking about the equality of the soul, who were thinking about what John Brown was called, which was a soldier of the Lord, right? This idea that when they're marching for something, right, they're trampling out the vintage, right? That this is a holy endeavor of equality because everybody is equal in the eyes of God. Now, what's interesting about the way that Brooklyn is built up, Brooklyn, of course, is a city of churches. That's its nickname. And so when we're talking about the way that Brooklyn Heights in particular becomes this hotbed of these movements for equality that are religious in their zeal and in their sort of moral rectitude, it's interesting to think about the way that the physical fabric of the city maps onto that we have all of these churches. But in the 1880s, as the movement picks up steam, so will the physical fabric of the city itself. The physical fabric of Brooklyn and of Manhattan begin to change. And what's interesting, when we look into the harbor, we can really see that. So in the 1870s and 1880s, we have the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, which strikingly enough actually becomes a feminist landmark. So this takes 10 years to build, 1873 to 1883. It opens May 24th, 1883. It's the longest suspension bridge in the world. It's immediately declared the 8th wonder of the world. And it would not stand without the work and the brilliance of Emily Warren Roblin. So this is Emily Warren Roblin. Now, the original design for the Brooklyn Bridge was conceived of and designed by John Roblin, who was her father-in-law. John Roblin dies very early on in the building of this bridge. And so the work of chief engineer goes to Washington Roblin, who was Emily Warren Roblin's husband. Washington Roblin fairly quickly contracts the bends, which is the disease that you get when you dive down under the river and then you come up too fast. It's the oxygen in the blood, but it doesn't kill Washington Roblin. It does incapacitate him though. And he's only able to look at the bridge from his window here in Brooklyn Heights. And he actually has to use a telescope to see the bridge site. He can't go to the bridge site. So Emily becomes his eyes and ears at the construction site. So she'll step in as, and she's so integral to the project. She's so necessary to the completion of the bridge that she was actually honored as the first person to cross it. Today, there's a plaque honoring her on the bridge itself. She wrote to her son, "The name Roblin would never be associated with the Brooklyn Bridge if it were not for my work. Thank goodness I have more sense than any two engineers put together, civil or uncivil." Now, Emily went on beyond even this incredible triumph of the Brooklyn Bridge, and she moved into the realm of advocating for women. She did that by earning a law degree at NYU Law School. The work of the women of NYU Law will be part of this lecture. I'll speak about them more a little bit later, but she will then move on to, in her later life, writing op-eds about women having a greater degree of jurisdiction over their children, because when women were married, their children legally, whatever children they bore or had already, would become wards of their husbands and not of themselves. And so she thought that that was not appropriate, and she advocated with her law degree against that statute. But she actually died in 1903. She died very young, and so she never saw the 19th Amendment pass, but she certainly did work on behalf of women. And speaking of women, in the harbor, we have this woman. This is Lily Deborah Blake, who was very, very angry 3 years after the Brooklyn Bridge opened. So the Brooklyn Bridge opens 1883. In 1886, Lily Deborah Blake is upset because October 28th, 1886 is the day that the Statue of Liberty is dedicated in New York Harbor. Now that day, Lily Deborah Blake led 60 members of the New York State Women's Suffrage Association into the harbor. They commandeered a barge and they covered it with protest banners. And they argued that the Statue of Liberty was essentially an abomination. They argued that the statue, quote, points afresh to the cruelty of women's present position, since it is proposed to represent freedom as a majestic female form in a state where not one woman is free. So this began in 1868, but would continue every year on the anniversary of the dedication of this statue until women were granted the right to vote. And you can see a cartoon, this is from 1915, joking about Woodrow Wilson. He certainly was not. His views are being reassessed now in a variety of ways, but one way that we can reassess them is to realize that Woodrow Wilson physically shook every time he heard a woman speak, that he was so disgusted by women and so against women's suffrage. But this charge that Lily Deborah Blake makes, right, that it's pointing out the cruelty of women's present position because it proposes to present freedom in a majestic female form in a state where not one woman is free. When we're speaking about free people, it's really important, I think, to discuss the role of slavery in Brooklyn. Slavery was actually more deeply embedded in Brooklyn prior to the Civil War than anywhere else outside of the American South. In fact, the New York Historical Society holds that New York City, and then Brooklyn in particular, had embedded slavery in the fabric of its everyday life to a degree that was only rivaled in Charleston. So there was a very large enslaved population in this city and in Brooklyn, but Brooklyn was also home to the second largest free Black community in antebellum America. And that community was Weeksville, which was not in Brooklyn Heights. It was in what is now Crown Heights. But I mention it here because the women of Weeksville will go on to have an incredible role in the suffrage movement, not only in Brooklyn, but nationally throughout the country. So this is Sarah Smith Garnet. She was the leader, the founder of the very first suffrage organization founded by and for Black women. That was the Equal Suffrage League of Brooklyn, which she founded in the late 1880s. Sarah Smith Garnet not only founded this organization, but also she was the first Black female principal within what would become the New York City public school system. Her sister was Susan Smith McKinney Stewart, who was also a trailblazer. Susan Smith McKinney Stewart was the first Black female doctor in New York State. These two women came from a family of pioneers. They were the daughters of Sylvanas Smith, who was one of the founders of Weeksville. Now, Weeksville was a land-owning community of free Black people, and it was specifically land-owning. Black New Yorkers began to buy land here in Weeksville, in Crown Heights and on the edges of what's now Bedford-Stuyvesant, after the Panic of 1837, so 10 years after slavery was abolished in New York State. It was abolished in 1827. So 10 years later, we have the founding of Weeksville because in order to exercise the franchise, in order to vote, Black men had to own $200 worth of property. There was not, after 1820, a property requirement in New York State for white men, and that was specifically to disenfranchise Black men. But the reason that I mention this is because Sylvanas Smith and his whole family, his daughters, Sarah and Susan, were very well aware of how important the franchise was and how much suffrage mattered to the idea of freedom and to the idea of being full participants in American democracy. And so it is not surprising to me that those two women, Sarah Smith Garnet and her sister Susan Smith McKinney Stewart, who were such incredible pioneers, became pioneers not only in their professions, which were education and medicine, but also within the women's suffrage movement. So these are the last surviving homes in Weeksville. They are the Hunterfly Road houses built between 1840 and 1880. After moving away from Weeksville, Susan Smith McKinney Stewart will live on DeKalb Avenue, but both she and her sister will worship here. Now, this is the old Bridge Street Church. This is another image of the church that I showed you earlier in this slide lecture. Now, the old Bridge Street Church was the oldest Black church in Brooklyn, and it was known as the center of Black Brooklyn. It's very important to our story because Susan Smith McKinney Stewart was actually the organist for this church, and her sister, Sarah Smith Garnet, is actually buried here. Susan Smith McKinney Stewart is buried at Greenwood, but Sarah Smith Garnet is buried here. Now, the two sisters were very active, of course, in the Equal Suffrage League. When Sarah Smith Garnet founded it, she actually founded it in the back of her seamstress shop in Brooklyn, because then as now, school teachers were not paid enough and she needed to have a second job. So she had a seamstress shop for 30 years. And in the back of that seamstress shop, she had this incredible suffrage organization, which grew and grew and grew into the turn of the 20th century, and thereupon relocated to the YMCA on Carlton Avenue, which was the first Black YMCA in Brooklyn. Now, because of her service to equal suffrage, Sarah Smith Garnet was elected superintendent of the suffrage department of the National Organization of Colored Women. And soon, African American women's suffrage organizations proliferated throughout Brooklyn. So the Garnet sisters worked with a group of Black women, including Ida B. Wells and Matricia Lyons, to create the Women's Loyal Union of New York and Brooklyn. That suffrage organization was founded in 1892. Now, the first president of the Women's Loyal Union of New York and Brooklyn was this woman, Victoria Earle Matthews, who was born into slavery in Georgia and went on to become one of the most prominent Black activists in the United States. She began her career as a journalist while still in her teens and went on to publish fiction and deliver lectures such as The Awakening of the Afro-American Woman. So in addition to her leadership of the union, she also co-founded and chaired the National Federation of Afro-American Women. And her work extended not only to Brooklyn, but also to Manhattan. And when her son died at the age of 16, she became deeply invested in helping young people. So in 1897, she founded the White Rose Mission, which was also known as the Working Class Home for Negro Girls, which was founded on 86th Street in Manhattan. Now, I've been speaking about a lot of trailblazers, and this is one of the most extraordinary of those trailblazers. This is Charlotte E. Rey. She was the first Black female lawyer in the United States and the first woman of any background to be admitted to the Washington, D.C. bar. She graduated from Howard Law School in 1872 And after a few years of practice, she moved to Brooklyn, where she became a teacher, actually in the same school where Sarah Smith Garnet was principal. So she taught, that was known as Colored School Number 1 in what's now Williamsburg. So they taught together. And Charlotte E. Rey joined Sarah Smith Garnet's organization, which was the Equal Suffrage League of Brooklyn. And so Charlotte E. Rey, throughout her life, became a suffragist and joined the National Organization of Colored Women and applied her knowledge of the law to that work. Now, the role of legal education and of women in law school cannot be overstated in its importance to the women's movement. It is an extraordinary turning point when women begin to study law. Now, Charlotte E. Rey is truly a pioneer by certainly decades. She graduates again from Howard Law School in 1872. But there will not be a women's law class in this nation until 1891. Charlotte E. Rey, it has been said that she was admitted to Howard because she used her initials. She applied as C.E. Rey, and it was unknown to the admissions committee that she actually was a woman before she appeared on campus, but was so brilliant that she was allowed to continue in her studies. Now, the reason I mention this is because the very first women's law class that was dedicated for that purpose opened at NYU in 1891. Now, the first valedictorian of NYU Law School lived at 62 to 64 Montague Street. I mention this for a couple of reasons. I don't have a picture of her because I could not find one. Her name is Cornelia K. Hood. She was an extraordinary woman, and I will tell you why. But she was also, in a very real way, written out of history. For example, this building, 62 to 64 Montague Street, is not only gorgeous, but also was home to Arthur Miller, who has a plaque here. There's a plaque honoring Arthur Miller on this building. And I love Arthur Miller. I believe that Death of a Salesman is the finest work of American drama. It is extraordinary. He certainly deserves a plaque. I'm not arguing that in any way, shape, or form. I love Arthur Miller. But I also believe that Cornelia K. Hood, who lived here also, is a plaqueless pioneer who deserves a plaque. I will tell you why. So, Cornelia K. Hood was one of the first women in this nation to earn a law degree. When the women's law class opened at NYU in 1890, Cornelia K. Hood was one of the first women to attend. So that NYU women's law class only existed really for a year. There were a number of women who, it was a degree granting program. So you could study in that program, and then because those women were so devoted to their studies, the faculty of NYU voted unanimously to allow them to matriculate at NYU Law School the following year. And so the women who went on to study for LLB degrees, they did not earn JDs. JDs didn't exist yet, so they earned LLBs. The women who earned those began earning them in 1893, and Cornelia K. Hood was one. But before she got that degree, she was the valedictorian of the first women's law class in 1891, and she gave a valedictory address, which was entitled, "Why I Study Law." Now, she said, as part of that valedictory address, "The laws of the land do not protect the natural rights of women sufficiently, nor do they seek to place her on a mental or moral equivalent with man. Women must bring about this elevation, which they sorely need. To do this, they must organize, and the legal advisors among themselves will be indispensable." So she knew that this education would not only benefit her as a woman and as a lawyer, but that if she could share the wealth, if she could share what she had learned with other women, she could help women organize around legal issues that really did plague them. And she did that. She was known as the Brooklyn Portia, and she pioneered a series called Law Lectures for Women, which were held at the Brooklyn Institute for Arts and Sciences, which I mentioned earlier, became what is now the Brooklyn Museum. So again, there were all of these institutions that helped make this possible in Brooklyn Heights. So these were so important to the women of Brooklyn, these law lectures, that even after she died, they continued as a memorial law lecture series. Now, women were so hungry for legal advice because women were so deeply disadvantaged. This was not women just not having the vote. It was also that if you were married, you forfeited any wealth that you might inherit over to your husband. You forfeited any bank account you might have. In fact, you could not open a bank account without your husband's permission. In certain states, you would actually forfeit, like if you were to marry across state lines or even across international lines, you could lose your citizenship if you were marrying across international lines and you would take your husband's citizenship, or if you were marrying across state lines, you would not be considered, as having any kind of residence in that state anymore. I mean, the degree to which women were disenfranchised under the laws of the United States, I think, is not necessarily wholly understood today. We think of this fight as a fight for the vote, but it was a fight for so much more than that. Users were deeply indispensable to women who were really trying to navigate a very thorny sort of legal experience that they had as single and then married women and so on and so forth, and then what it meant if you wanted to be divorced and all these things. And so not only does Cornelia K. Hood take on this role as a law lecturer for other women, but she also becomes the president of the Kings County Political Equality League, which had its first meeting in 1894 at the Brooklyn Historical Society, which we saw earlier on Pierpont Street. Now, she is not the only lawyer to be president of the Kings County Political Equality League. So the Political Equality League is founded in 1894, as I said, by Cornelia K. Hood, who is the first president. Well, the following year, Rosalie Lowe Whitney, who lived here at 212 Columbia Heights, graduated from NYU Law. So this is Rosalie Lowe Whitney. She is a member of the class of NYU Law 1895. She is the first woman to try a case before the New York Supreme Court. She will also replace Frances Perkins on the New York State Industrial Commission in 1919. And then in 1935, at the same time as Frances Perkins was serving as Secretary of Labor, Rosalie Lowe Whitney was appointed to the bench by Fiorello LaGuardia, and she served on the Court of Domestic Relations. Now, speaking of labor lawyers who were educated at NYU Law School, we have this woman. This is Inez Milholland. Inez Milholland was born and raised in Brooklyn, and she became many things. One was a labor lawyer. The other was an icon of the women's suffrage movement. She really became the Joan of Arc of this movement. So Inez Milholland, as I said, is born in Brooklyn. She's born into a very progressive family. Her father, John Milholland, was a founder of the Men's League for Women's Suffrage and also a co-founder of the NAACP. So she comes with this very progressive upbringing She also was very, very wealthy. Her father made his money in pneumatic tubes, which is, I think of them as mail subways. They're kind of like 19th century Twitter. So that's how he makes his money. And she is sent to Vassar. And at Vassar, it is against school policy for women to speak about women's suffrage on campus. So Enos Mulholland brings 2/3 of the student body and half of the faculty into the graveyard outside of the gates of Vassar and lectures about suffrage and socialism. She goes on to graduate from Vassar and to then graduate from NYU Law School in 1912. She will live in Greenwich Village. She will actually be married to Eugene Boissevain. You can see her married name is Boissevain. I mentioned that because after she died, and I'll tell you how she dies, Eugene Boissevain went on to marry another Greenwich Village woman by the name of Edna St. Vincent Millay, so who was also a Vassar grad, and wrote, when Enos Mulholland died, wrote an ode to Enos Mulholland. They were very good friends. So it was quite a heady scene at the time. But the reason that I mention Enos Mulholland and her death is that she was this extraordinary labor lawyer. She was this beautiful, very rich woman. She was sort of the poster child, in fact, virtually the poster child for what will become the women's movement. And it is this idea of purity, which you can see here, of harkening back to a medieval past. This is a very, she's literally wearing white, but it is a very sort of whitewashed look at what the women's movement was, as we have seen in this slide lecture. Of course, there were Black women every step of the way deeply involved in this, but Enos Mulholland gives a very specific image of the women's movement. She was also a labor lawyer and a socialist. When she graduated from NYU Law School, she will actually take as a client Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who was the first female head of the American Communist Party. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn had organized a Sacco and Vanzetti Defense Committee, which worked out as well for her as it did for Sacco and Vanzetti, which just is to say that it did not, and she was arrested. And so Enos Mulholland came to her defense. Then, of course, Enos Mulholland leads this suffrage parade in 1913. That's what we're seeing. She's leading the 1913 suffrage parade, which was given the day before the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson. And her rallying cry was, "Mr. Wilson, how long will women wait for liberty?" And in fact, those were her last words. In 1916, she will be giving a lecture for the National Women's Party. She'll go on a lecture tour, and she's in Los Angeles, and she's so exhausted by this tour and by the sort of torrent of energy it takes to be this icon, that she gives this lecture and she says, "Mr. Wilson, how long will women wait for liberty?" And actually she faints on stage and is taken to the hospital and dies after giving this lecture. She dies actually at the age of 30. And so she becomes this sort of incredible martyr of the movement, but she didn't organize this suffrage parade. Well, who did? It was another Brooklyn woman by the name of Lucie Burns. So Lucie Burns, I show you her here in jail because Lucie Burns has the designation of having been jailed more times than any other woman in the lead up to the passage of the 19th Amendment. She was a lifelong Brooklynite. She was born and raised actually in Park Slope at 94 President Street, but she was educated in Brooklyn Heights. Oops. Oh, all right, there it is. At Packer Collegiate, which began as a women's school. And she herself taught also in Brooklyn at Erasmus Hall Academy. But She too, just like Inez Milholland, graduated from Vassar and then went to study at Columbia University. And after that, continued her studies in Germany and finally at Oxford. And while she's at the UK, she becomes involved in militant British women's suffrage under the auspices of Emmeline Pankhurst and the Women's Social and Political Union. And speaking of being jailed, she's also jailed in England. And while she is there, she will meet another American in England named Alice Paul. Alice Paul is not really in this tour because she is not from Brooklyn or New York at all. She's actually from Pennsylvania. But Alice Paul and Lucy Burns return to the United States in 1912. And they decide to bring that militant spirit that they found in England to the United States. And so they begin to organize the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, which will become in 1916 the National Women's Party. And it is Alice Paul and Lucy Burns who organized this women's suffrage procession, where we can see Inez Milholland. Lucy Burns is really instrumental in organizing suffrage schools to teach other women how to campaign in this militant way that she learned in England. And she is also chiefly responsible for the silent sentinels, who you can see here have chained themselves in certain circumstances to the gates of the White House. Now, the silent sentinels began in 1917 and did not let up. They picketed the White House every day until the passage of the 19th Amendment. And what's so interesting to me about this photograph is that we can actually see the impact that Inez Milholland, or at least her sloganeering and her image, has had on the women's movement. So now she is no longer alive, but her slogan, this idea, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" really is this rallying cry. And it's, I think, important to talk about that, because the images that we have of these suffrage parades are sort of calm kind of images in a way. And yes, I mean, we see Lucy Burns here in jail, but this was not a calm situation. These were actually extremely dangerous efforts to undertake, because these women were attacked. They were also force-fed in prison. It was a very brave thing to do, what they undertook. But it was also true that when women marched at these suffrage parades, they were not marching in an integrated fashion. Even though, as we've seen, Black women were so intimately involved in the success of this movement. And Ida B. Wells was very famous in 1917 for refusing actually to march behind the white delegation at this parade, and so did integrate it with her own body. And so when we talk about how difficult it was for white women who were force-fed and how extraordinary that courage was, I just want to honor the courage of Black women who had to be doubly and even more so courageous in these same circumstances. But the idea of women on the march who were here and who kept going, what I want to say is that there were other women in Brooklyn Heights who were part of this story. So this is the last home of Lucy Burns at 39 Pierpont Street. She would retire to Brooklyn Heights. But the first home of Dorothy Day, who was also jailed in 1917 at the Silent Sentinel marches, and went on to found the Catholic Worker and to be considered a Catholic anarchist, which I think is a really interesting two things, and again sort of brings us back to this army of the Lord thing, this idea that what's underpinning so much of what's going on here is a commitment to equality in the eyes of God. I want to say that what's interesting about her is that she actually was born on Pineapple Street. She was born in Brooklyn Heights, and is now considered for sainthood. And so this question of what does this neighborhood, what does its institutions mean to this movement? I think it's really interesting to see how this neighborhood nurtured women of all backgrounds, whether they be, any denomination of Christian, of Jewish, of Black, of white, that there were women living in Brooklyn, and particularly in Brooklyn Heights, who went on to be the real leaders in this movement and so many other social justice movements throughout the 20th century. And so, thank you very much. That's what I've got. I would love to answer any questions. Anybody can unmute if they would like and ask me anything you like.
Just want to say thank you. Very, very informative talk that you gave. And it's quite fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there anything else I can answer?
Hello, Michelle, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, hi. Well, thanks for a great presentation. My question is, what were the relationships between the African American women and the white women? What was their dialogue? What was their sense of reciprocity and mutual respect?
Well, I think it depends who you are asking and who you are speaking about. For example, there were certain women like Alice Paul who would not allow Black women, to attend the National Women's Party celebration for the passage of the 19th Amendment, who were really openly racist and just not interested in including Black women in the movement in any way. But there were also white women who were part of this movement, who were also part of the founding of the NAACP, and were, like, I think fairly open to understanding the contributions of Black women and really being allies in that struggle. And so I think it really depends who you think about and who you ask. So somebody like Lillian Wald, who founded the Henry Street Settlement, the NAACP was actually also founded in the dining room at the Henry Street Settlement, and then would go on to have its first public meeting at Cooper Union in 1909. And so there were white women in this struggle who were also part of things like the founding of the NAACP. And so there was that kind of understanding, but I'm not going to pretend as if it was across the board or as if it was rosy, because it certainly was not. That there was a real, work on the part of white suffragists to discount the work of Black suffragists. For example, the reason that we know as much as we do about Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton is because they wrote the history of the suffrage movement. And so they, as as members of the National Women's Suffrage Association, right, we're not going to write about the American Women's Suffrage Association. In fact, in their book on the history of the suffrage movement, they devote like one chapter to that history versus, you know, several chapters to their own. And so while it was known within the movement, I think more than was ever put into the historical record, I think that's what I would say, was that it was more apparent within the movement than was ever left to posterity, because there were certain women who chose to not put it in. Although the women who ultimately, the white women who were the most open, interestingly enough, to sharing a true historical record of the suffrage movement, which would have been to express the just overwhelming participation of Black women and their sort of overwhelming import to the struggle, were members of the socialist and anarchist parties. That women like Crystal Eastman, who was also a graduate of NYU Law School, who wrote for Liberator magazine. Her brother was Max Eastman. He was jailed for the Masses magazine, so on and so forth. But she actually wrote to Alice Paul, and she said, if you do not include whom she called Negro women in your movement, we can only say, she wrote this in 1920, she said, we can only say, if the concerns of Negro women are not included, that the suffrage movement in the United States has ended. We cannot say that the feminist movement has begun. So there were some people who understood the limits and the flaws of the mainstream suffrage movement, but they actually tended to be on the sort of leftward edges of the political spectrum, which is interesting to me.
No surprise there.
Yeah.
Well, Michelle, I've so enjoyed this presentation, and I hope I'll have a conversation with you later on maybe some other ideas to go further with. But thank you so much. I learned a lot. Thank you.
I'm so glad.
So I wanted to ask Lucie if she has any thoughts about other ways to commemorate these lesser known women from the suffrage movement, these women from Brooklyn.
Well, I want plaques for my plaqueless pioneers, right? I want Cornelia K. Hood to have her plaque right next to Arthur Miller. But I think beyond that, I would be interested in seeing the writing of these women being collected in popular histories. I actually had the opportunity to work on something that I thought was really cool, which was a documentary called Speech, which is still in development, but it was about taking the words of Black orators and remixing them into music that could then be popularly accessible. And it was this idea of, okay, how do you make this incredible oratory, this incredible history that's lesser known, more popularly accessible? And I think that that's an interesting way to think about it. I wonder about statuary today, of course, because the city of New York is actively trying to increase the number of women in its public statuary at the same time as the nation is really sort of grappling with what public statuary means and who do we memorialize and how and what's appropriate. And while I think there's a lot of merit in that, like I'm really excited that Shirley Chisholm is getting a statue and things like this, I also wonder does that kind of memorialization make these women who are lesser known more popularly accessible? And I don't necessarily know the answer to that. So my question would be, what is the most popularly accessible framework to hear from these women? And when I say hear from these women, I always want to hear their words. I always think that learning about somebody's biography is interesting and edifying, but when I hear them speaking through the historical record, that to me is the most salient, and that's the hardest thing to do, because that's what gets lost the most quickly. And so I don't have an answer necessarily as to what that would look like, but that to me I think would be the most moving, would be to have their oratory, their words, become popularly accessible. And I don't know necessarily what that would look like.
Michelle, if I could chime in, this is Kate again. The New York Preservation Archives, as you know, maybe you could locate, or we could make it a constructed effort to locate the descendants of the African American women that you've talked so much about, and I couldn't possibly remember all the names. I just know McKinney Seward because of other projects. But the point is that perhaps they have descendants we could locate and maybe get some oral history.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
I would totally be as helpful as I could in any way you thought would be constructive to help that come about.
I think that would be phenomenal. I think that would be really, really wonderful. And I know that the Preservation Archive Project is looking for more diverse voices. So I think that would be a really wonderful way to do that.
Yeah, we could, I could find, and if you have the, knowledge to locate these people, that is totally beyond my purview. But, just to get your mind moving, because you have nothing else to do.
Yeah, I love that. I'm really great. If you would like to email me or HTC or anybody, I can give
Okay.
you.
We won't take everybody's time up. I'll follow up.
Okay. Can I just jump in here for a second? This is Jeremy. I'm the chair of the Brooklyn Heights Association Landmarks Committee. And I can tell you that we are very interested in expanding the history of landmarks in Brooklyn Heights to include more architecture, but also to include cultural sites and people who are culturally relevant to the history of Brooklyn Heights. And a big part of that is the women's suffrage movement. And so we're definitely working on both written histories and public programming that's going to incorporate a lot of this type of information.
Fabulous. I'm so happy to hear that.
Lucie, first I wanted to thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and all the work you did to make it possible. And I wanted to say two things. One is there somewhere writing or that you've done or some source we could go to refer to what you've presented so that we could pass it on, learn it more fully, and so forth? How could we have access to the presentation you've made and this important information? That's my first question.
Well, I do have an article that I published on 6 Square Feet in 2018 called Brownstones and Ballot Boxes, which describes some of these women, but not all of them. I am also happy to share my PowerPoint itself with Michelle, and then she can send it out to anybody who saw this talk. This is also being recorded, or is it, Michelle, being recorded?
Yeah, it's being recorded, so it'll be available on the HTC website as well as the HTC YouTube page.
Right, so you can refer to this at any time.
And we could also send email. Is there a way to get the article that you put out?
Yeah, I can send that to Michelle, and then she can send it to all participants.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, my other question was, I'm a singer and a songwriter, and I would be very interested in the, I think, wonderful idea of how some of women's words could be put into song, because that's a powerful way to get this important information out.
Yeah, I'd love to speak further about that. Again, Michelle can share my contact information with everybody who was at this talk, and then we can all follow up.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I would love that.
Yeah, if I get your email, I will send you the history of my work and samples and so forth. I'd love to do that.
Perfect. That sounds great.
I'll send a follow-up email to everyone.
Great. And one other idea, in addition to music, and maybe including music, there could be theatrical work done.
I think there was very recently a play regarding women's suffrage. I don't remember the exact title of that play, but I don't think that that's untrad territory. Not that there couldn't be another play, there certainly could. But just to say that that's such a good idea that in fact somebody has done that, but I think that's great.
Great. I recorded Bread and Roses, and I composed a new melody for it because I really love the words, but I found the melodies, there are more than one, a little dirgy. So, and there's going to be a program on Joy of Resistance, which is a feminist program on WBAI radio, 99.5 FM. On the last Monday of August, and I've been asked to find 3 songs or write 3 songs to contribute 6-hour, 11 to 5 special. I think it's August 26th, Monday, on the centenary of women getting the vote. So I have a bunch of research to do anyway that I'm excited about.
Wonderful.
It's amazing.
Well, do share a reminder for all of us so we can listen in.
Okay, all right. Yeah, maybe send me people's contact information and I will be delighted
Yeah, looking forward to it.
If you send me the info, I can post it on our Facebook.
Great. Great.
Lovely. Thank you so much, everyone. If there are no further questions, I think we are good to end it. We are a little over. So thank you, Lucie. And again, this has all been recorded, so it'll probably be up middle of next week. I'd say probably Monday or Tuesday.
Great.
Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.